The name hit him like a blade through centuries of silence. Cordelia Ellis. Vladislav Darkmoor stood in the center of the ancient underground archive beneath Harrogate Court, his white hair catching the cold blue light of the preservation lamps, his silver eyes fixed on the crumbling page before him. He had searched for this name for 340 years. He had turned over the bones of dead empires, burned through the records of fallen courts, sent emissaries into the human world with instructions precise as surgical instruments. He had offered fortunes, he had offered blood debts. He had, on 2 occasions that still darkened his memory, been forced to offer something far more terrible. And now here, in a document recovered from a flooded Venetian archive just 6 days ago, the name appeared in fresh ink on a printout from a modern human institution, a library in Edinburgh. He felt the ancient vow in his chest pull tight like a wire drawn through his ribs. 340 years ago, he had made that vow to a dying woman who had pressed her palm against his cheek and told him that the line would continue, that the name would survive, that he would find it when the world needed it most. He had not known what that meant. He still did not know entirely. But the Vethara Compact, the oldest and most dangerous treaty in vampire law, was dissolving. 3 of the 5 ancient courts were moving toward open war, and buried inside the Compact's founding text was a clause so obscure that most vampires believed it a myth. A witnessing clause, one human name, passed down through a specific bloodline, held the legal authority under ancient vampire law to stand as a neutral arbiter in any dispute among the founding courts. Not a servant, not a pawn, a witness. A voice the courts were bound by oath to hear before violence could be declared legitimate. The name in the founding text, written in the original blood script of the 5 signatories, was Ellis, and the modern descendant of that line. According to records that his most trusted emissary, Seraphiel, had pieced together across 4 continents, was a 26-year-old special collections librarian at the Aldermore Public Archive in Edinburgh, Scotland, Cordelia Ellis. Vladislav closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds, which for a being who had lived through the fall of Constantinople was the equivalent of taking a very long and steadying breath. Then he opened them, straightened his coat, and said to the darkened room, "Seraphiel." His second-in-command materialized from the shadows near the far wall as she always did, as if she had been part of the architecture until summoned. She was lean and ancient, her white hair cropped to her jaw, her expression the precise calibration of someone who had survived 800 years by never showing more emotion than was strategically necessary. "My lord," she said, "we leave within the hour," Vladislav said, "and Seraphiel. Under no circumstances does Radzivic's court learn where we are going." Seraphiel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You believe he already knows the compact is failing?" "I believe Radzivic has known for longer than we have," Vladislav said, "and I believe he has his own plans for the witnessing clause that have nothing to do with law or peace." He picked up the printout. The photograph beside the name showed a young woman with dark auburn hair and wire-framed glasses, standing beside a library cart with the specific expression of someone who was explaining something important and slightly annoyed that it needed explaining. Her eyes were sharp and dark and entirely unimpressed by whatever was happening in front of her camera. Vladislav felt something unusual move through him, not sentiment, not yet, but recognition of a quality he had not seen in a very long time. She looked, above all else, like someone who would not be moved by anything she did not choose to be moved by. He found himself, inexplicably, hoping that would not make what was coming harder. It would, of course. It absolutely would. The Aldermore Public Archive occupied a Georgian building on a narrow close off the Royal Mile, the kind of building that Edinburgh produced with the frequency of rain, which was to say constantly and without apology. It was 11:47 in the morning when Vladislav arrived, which was possible only because November in Scotland offered a pale, diffuse light that was tolerable to his kind when combined with the protective compound his court physician had refined over the past century. It was not comfortable, but it was survivable. He wore a long dark coat and the kind of stillness that ancient vampires wore like armor. He walked through the front doors of the archive and into the warmth of books. He had expected the atmosphere. What he had not expected was the sound of an argument. It was coming from the special collections room at the far end of the main hall, behind a half-open door of frosted glass. He could hear it clearly because his hearing was a precision instrument sharpened by centuries of needing to know when someone was lying from 4 rooms away. A man's voice, raised and entitled. "I've been waiting 3 weeks for this access approval, and I am telling you, I have contacts on the board of this institution who will make things very uncomfortable for you if you continue to be obstructive." And then a woman's voice, calm as a scalpel and twice as sharp. "Mr. Hartnell, your contacts on the board have exactly as much influence over the special collections access protocol as they do over the laws of physics, which is none. You were denied access because your research application failed to demonstrate the necessary scholarly credentials, and because 2 of your listed references were from institutions that do not exist. You are welcome to reapply when you have corrected both of those issues. Have a lovely afternoon." A door opened. A red-faced man in his 50s emerged, sputtering. He walked past Vladislav without looking at him, which was fortunate for him, because Vladislav's expression in that moment was not the kind that welcomed interruption. He pushed open the frosted glass door. She was standing behind a long oak counter, reshelving a series of documents in archival folders with the efficient movements of someone who had already mentally moved on from the confrontation she had just won. Her auburn hair was pulled back loosely. She wore a forest green cardigan over a white shirt, and the wire-framed glasses were precisely as described in the photograph. She glanced up. "Special collections is appointment only," she said, pleasantly but with absolute finality, "and we close for new appointments at 11. "I have a previous appointment," Vladislav said. She looked at the open appointment book on her counter. "Name? Darkmoor." She ran her finger down the page and stopped. Her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He had given the appointment under that name 2 days ago, through Seraphiel, and he had made sure the appointment was logged for 11:45, precisely because he had wanted to arrive before she had a chance to think too carefully about who might be making such a request. She looked up at him. He stood very still in the doorway and let her look, because that was the only honest thing he could offer her in this moment, and honesty was the one currency he had decided he would not compromise on. She was taking inventory, he realized, not flinching, not performing politeness, actually looking the way someone looks when deciding something. "You're very pale," she said. "I am," he agreed. "And your hair is white, entirely white. You're not old enough for entirely white hair." "I am considerably older than I appear," he said. Something shifted in her expression. "Not alarm. Calculation. What is it you wanted to see in the special collections, Mr. Darkmoor?" "The Ellis family archive," he said. "Specifically the documents donated in 1987 by a Helena Ellis, which I understand include personal correspondence from the late 17th century. The silence in the room changed quality. Cordelia Ellis set down the folder she was holding with careful precision. When she looked at him again, her dark eyes had sharpened into something very close to the expression he had seen in the photograph, and this close, that expression was considerably more formidable. "My great-great-aunt donated those documents," she said. "They're part of a private collection, and they're not available for general research access." "Who told you about them?" "The Vethara archive," he said. And then, because she deserved the full honest weight of it immediately rather than in pieces, "Miss Ellis, my name is Vladislav Darkmoor. I am the Lord of the Harrogate Court, which is one of the 5 founding vampire courts established under the Compact of 1683. I have been searching for a member of your bloodline for 340 years. I understand that what I am telling you is extraordinary. I have brought documentation. I need approximately 1 hour of your time, and I give you my word, which I will explain means something very specific and legally binding in my world, that I have no intention of harming you, and every intention of ensuring that no one else does either, because there are people who want to find you before I do, and they do not share my intentions." Cordelia Ellis stared at him. The clock on the wall ticked 4 times. "Close the door," she said. He did. She pulled a chair from the side of the counter and sat down in it with the posture of someone who has just made a decision and intends to carry it through correctly. "Show me the documentation." He reached into his coat and produced a folder. Not the crumbling originals. Seraphiel had prepared high-resolution copies, authenticated and translated, with annotations in English. He set it on the counter. She picked it up. She began to read. He watched her read, which was something he had not done with genuine attention in perhaps 2 centuries, and found that it was unexpectedly absorbing. She read with her whole face, a slight furrow between her brows when something required passing, a slight compression of her lips when something surprised her. She turned pages with the specific care of someone who worked with rare documents daily, and extended that care automatically to everything on paper, regardless of whether the paper warranted it. After 11 minutes, she looked up. "This clause," she said, tapping the relevant page. "The witnessing clause. It says the designated witness has legal authority to compel a hearing, but cannot compel an outcome." "Correct," he said. "So if I agree to do this, I stand in front of 3 warring vampire courts and give testimony, and they can listen and then do whatever they like anyway. The Compact's blood law requires any court that hears a legitimate witnessing to hold a 40-day peace before taking any violent action. It is not permanent resolution, but 40 days is considerable time in a political crisis. It creates a window for negotiation that would not otherwise exist. And the courts that want to find me before you do," she said. "Radzevich's court." He had not expected her to retain and deploy that name from the documentation so quickly. He recalibrated slightly. "You read very fast." "I'm a librarian," she said, as if this were self-evident. "Radzevich, his court opposed the original compact, according to your notes. He spent 3 centuries trying to have the witnessing clause removed from the founding text. If a living witness appears and successfully compels a hearing, it validates the entire compact, including the blood law provisions that limit his court's expansion." "Yes," Vladislav said. "So he wants me dead." The word landed in the room with the weight it deserved. Vladislav did not soften it because she had not asked him to. "Yes, or permanently incapacitated. Either eliminates the witness from legal consideration." Cordelia set the folder down on the counter. She took off her glasses, cleaned them on her cardigan hem, and put them back on, which he would later come to understand was her particular method of resetting before making a significant decision. "I have questions," she said. "I have answers," he said. "As many as you require. How long have you known my name specifically?" 6 days. "How long has Radzevich known?" He paused. It was not a pause of evasion, it was a genuine pause of calculation. "We believe between 10 and 14 days. She absorbed this. "So he has a head start, which is why I am here at 11:47 in the morning instead of at midnight." The ghost of something crossed her face. It might have been, in different circumstances, almost amusement. "You're being harmed by the daylight right now, aren't you? Even through those clothes." He was not accustomed to being read that accurately by humans on a first meeting. He was also not accustomed to the particular sensation that accompanied being read accurately, which was something between discomfort and respect. "It is not pleasant," he admitted. "Then you came in daylight, specifically to reassure me," she said. "To demonstrate that you were willing to be uncomfortable to approach me openly, rather than wait for an advantage." "Yes," he said, simply. She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light fell through the archive's high windows and turned everything the color of old amber. He stood in it and did not move. "All right," she said. "I need to call someone to cover the archive for the rest of the day. I have an emergency kit in the back room because this building's boiler has failed 3 times this winter, and I've learned to be prepared." "Give me 10 minutes, Miss Ellis," he said, and something in his voice stopped her mid-turn. "I need you to understand completely, before we go any further, that what I am asking of you is genuinely dangerous. I will protect you with everything at my disposal. My court is formidable, and my word is absolute, but the danger is real. You are allowed to say no." She turned back. She looked at him with those sharp dark eyes and said, 340 years of searching, 3 warring courts, a blood law that's been waiting for a witness, and you're the only one offering protection rather than a threat." She picked up her phone from the counter. "Of course I'm going. I'd be an idiot not to go with the one person who needs me alive." She said it practically, as if it were a simple calculation. But he heard underneath the practicality something that was not simple at all, something that was courage dressed in sensible language, because that was the form it took in her. and he thought that this woman was going to be the most remarkable problem he had encountered in 3 centuries. He was not at that point thinking of her as anything other than the witness he had searched for. He would remember that thought later, in the way one remembers the last moment before a fall. They left through the archive's back entrance, which opened onto a narrow lane smelling of cold stone and old rain. Seraphiel was waiting with a car, a black vehicle with tinted windows, and she opened the rear door with the expression of someone who had been monitoring the building's perimeter for potential threats, and was deeply satisfied that there had been none. Cordelia got into the car. She looked at Seraphiel with the same frank assessment she had given Vladislav. "You're also a vampire," she said. 812 years, Seraphiel said, which was her version of a confirmation. "Remarkable," Cordelia said, and meant it. She settled into the seat and looked out the window as Edinburgh moved past. "Harrogate Court," Vladislav said, sitting beside her. "It is, technically speaking, below Edinburgh. Below it." "The old city is built on layers," he said. "Your historians know the medieval layer, the one that tourists visit. There are layers beneath that. We are considerably further down." "How deep?" "Deep enough that what happens there is not visible to the modern world," he said. "But not so deep that it is disconnected from it. We monitor human political and legal systems with considerable attention. We have adapted to the modern world rather than hiding from it entirely. We pay taxes, Miss Ellis. Well, our surface world holdings do, through a series of legal structures that would require more than one car ride to explain." She looked at him. "Vampires pay taxes. The alternative is drawing the attention of human governmental bodies, which is considerably more trouble than the taxes." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard it. It was unexpected and genuine, and it struck him somewhere behind the sternum with the particular force of things that are genuinely surprising. He looked forward at the road and said nothing. Harrogate Court occupied a subterranean complex accessed through a private building near Greyfriars Kirkyard, which Vladislav had always considered a location with appropriate aesthetic resonance. The complex itself was a series of chambers that would not have been out of place in a continental palace circa 1740, all carved stone and vaulted ceilings and lighting that managed to feel warm despite having no natural source. Cordelia walked through it with her chin level and her eyes cataloguing everything, and he watched her not show fear with a professional attention. "Your court lives here permanently?" she asked, as they moved through the main gallery. "Those who choose to," he said. "Many maintain what humans would call ordinary lives above. Apartments, occupations, the whole architecture of modern living. We are not isolated from the human world. We are woven into it. But there's a court," she said, "with court politics and blood law and a compact. The old structures persist even when the surface adapts," he said. "In that we are perhaps not so different from human institutions." She considered this. "And the other courts? How many vampires are we talking about in total?" He paused at the doors to the private study he had prepared for this conversation. "The 5 founding courts together account for perhaps 4,000 vampires across Europe and the former Eastern Empire. There are independent bloodlines beyond that, but the compact courts are the political powers." 4,000, she said softly. "Living alongside 8 billion humans. Quietly," he said, "carefully, and with, historically speaking, a great deal of effort devoted to ensuring that continues to be possible." He opened the study doors. Inside, a long table was covered in documents, maps, and translated texts. A fire burned in the stone hearth. On a side table, a covered tray held food and tea, because Seraphiel had thought of it before he had, which was one of many reasons she had survived 8 centuries. Cordelia went directly to the documents on the table, which he had expected. She began reading with the same absolute focus he had observed in the archive. He moved to the other side of the table and stood, watching the fire, giving her space. After 20 minutes, she said, without looking up, "Sit down. You make the room feel like it's holding its breath when you stand like that." He sat. After 10 more minutes, she looked up. The Radzivich Court. These expansion records, they're trying to consolidate control over the other 3 courts through the collapse of the compact. If the compact fails, there's no binding blood law. Each court is independent. Radzivich is the largest and most powerful, so independence means dominance. Yes, he said. And if I invoke the witnessing clause, it forces all 5 courts to acknowledge the compact as still binding, including Radzevich, which is why he cannot allow a witness to successfully invoke it, Vladislav said. The 40-day peace alone would be enough to derail his current positioning. He has alliances that depend on the compact failing within the next few weeks. She set the document down and looked at him across the table. The firelight was doing something to the angles of her face, and he made himself not notice it too carefully. What happens if we don't succeed? If I invoke the clause and Radzevich finds a way to block it, or if I'm killed before I can invoke it? The compact fails, he said. The blood law dissolves. 3 courts go to war within weeks. 4,000 vampires in open conflict is not something the human world can remain oblivious to indefinitely. The concealment structures that have protected both our kinds for 4 centuries collapse. Both our kinds, she said quietly. You said that carefully. Because I mean it, he said. The concealment has protected humans as much as vampires. 4,000 vampires at war in the modern world is a catastrophe for every person on this planet. The compact was designed to prevent exactly that. It has worked for 340 years. This crisis is the first serious threat to its structural integrity, and it is a severe one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You've spent 340 years keeping something stable that protects a world most of that world doesn't know needs protecting. That is one way to frame it, he said. It's the accurate way, she said. And there was something in her voice that was not quite sympathy but was close to recognition, and he felt it land with unexpected precision. He looked at her across the document-covered table and said, The witnessing invocation requires your presence at a formal convening of all 5 courts. Getting you there safely is my primary concern. Radzevich will have agents watching every approach. We need to move carefully and quickly, and I need you to follow my guidance on the security protocols, not because I believe you incapable of judgment, but because the threat landscape is my expertise, and this archive room is yours. She nodded slowly. Fair division of authority. Yes, and after the convening, assuming it works. You are free, he said. The clause is invoked, the peace holds, negotiations begin. Your role as witness is complete. You return to your life. Something passed across her face at that. Something brief and unreadable. Then she said, All right, tell me about the security protocols. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and he discovered in that time that Cordelia Ellis had a mind like a well-organized archive. Vast, methodically structured, and capable of retrieving exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment. She asked questions that found the weaknesses in his plans before he had finished articulating them. She identified 3 logistical problems with the proposed route to the convening site that he and Seraphiel had missed. She was, quietly and without self-congratulation, formidably intelligent. He also discovered that she had a habit of going very still when she was thinking hardest, like something had turned off all the extraneous movement in her to direct maximum resources inward, and that when she reached a conclusion, she stated it with a directness that was entirely without performance, and that she was brave in the particular way that people are brave when they have thought the danger through completely and decided to proceed anyway, which he considered the only kind of bravery that mattered. The trouble arrived, as it was always going to, from the direction he least wanted it. The fire in the study hearth went out, not gradually, all at once, snuffed, as if the air had simply decided to withdraw its cooperation. Vladislav was on his feet before Cordelia had finished registering the change, moving between her and the door. Seraphiel came through the door 1 second later, and the controlled urgency in her face told him everything. 3 of Radzevich's court, there above. They found the surface access point. How? He said. A trace we missed on the Venetian archive records, Seraphiel said, her voice tight with the anger she was compressing into efficiency. They knew about the name 6 days before us. They've been following the same document trail. Vladislav turned. Cordelia was standing behind him, and she was looking at the door with the focused calm of someone who has accepted a situation they cannot change and is now interested only in what to do about it. She had picked up, he noticed, the heaviest of the document binders from the table. Holding it at her side, it was not a weapon. It was not intended to be. It was, he suspected, a comfort mechanism that she had not even consciously chosen, and something about that small human gesture, the reaching for something solid and familiar in the face of threat, moved through him with a force that surprised him considerably. "Stay behind me," he told her. "I intend to," she said. "But I also need to tell you that there's a secondary access point to this chamber through the archive corridor on the east wall, behind the second bookcase. If you need to move me, that's the faster route." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "The building plans," she said. "I read them while you were reviewing the compact documentation this afternoon." "Habit. I always learn the architecture of a building I'm going to spend time in. Occupational hazard." He held her gaze for one moment that was longer than it needed to be, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Genuine, uncomplicated admiration. "Seraphiel," he said, without looking away from Cordelia. "East Archive Corridor." "Ahead of you," Seraphiel said, and moved. What followed was 20 minutes that Cordelia later described, with characteristic understatement, as quite eventful. Vladislav moved her through the East Archive corridor, while Seraphiel and two of his court's most trusted guards handled the three Radzivich agents above. He kept one hand at Cordelia's elbow, not gripping, just present, a point of contact that said here, and this way, and I have you, without requiring words. She matched his pace, without complaint and without panic, which meant he could move at close to his own speed without needing to calibrate for human limitations. And they were through the corridor and into the secondary chamber before any of the above-level disruption reached them. In the secondary chamber, which was a smaller stone room with a single heavy door, she finally let out a long breath. "Are they all right?" she said. "Your people." He was already receiving information through the specific resonance that ancient vampires maintained with their sworn court members, a sensory channel that had no human equivalent. "Seraphiel is managing," he said. "One of my guards has sustained an injury. Not critical. I'm sorry," she said, and meant it entirely. "Because of me, because of Radzivich," he said. "There is a distinction, and it matters." She looked at him. The lamplight in this room was lower, and the shadows fell differently, and she was close enough that he could see the specific dark amber in the outer ring of her brown irises, which was not a thing he should have been noticing. "You keep making those distinctions," she said, "between what is my responsibility and what isn't." Deliberately. "Yes," he said. "Why?" He considered the question with the care it deserved, because she asked it with the care it deserved. Because the guilt of circumstance, the guilt of simply being what someone needs, is a burden I refuse to place on you. You did not ask to be a witness. You did not ask for a 300-year-old clause to govern your existence. The danger you are in is not of your making. I will not allow the people who created that danger to also steal your sense of agency by making you feel responsible for its consequences." The silence that followed was long and warm, and entirely different from the silence that danger produces. "That," she said carefully, "is an extraordinarily thoughtful position for someone I met this morning." "I have had 340 years to think about what I would say to you," he said, and then stopped, because that had come out carrying rather more weight than he had intended. She did not look away. She said, "You thought about me specifically, not just about the witness." He found that he could not, with any integrity, pretend the question away. "As I began to learn who you were specifically, yes. The distinction between the witness and Cordelia Ellis is one I have been increasingly aware of as the day has proceeded." She opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the stone floor for a moment. "I don't know what to do with that," she said. "Honestly." "You do not need to do anything with it," he said. "It is simply true, and I told you that honesty is the one thing I will not compromise." She looked up. The expression on her face was something he could not fully read, which was extraordinary, because he had been reading faces for 7 centuries. It was complex and layered and a little frightened, not of him, he thought, but of something else, something internal. Before he could respond to any of it, Seraphiel came through the heavy door. She was immaculate, which meant things above had been resolved. "The 3 agents are contained," she said. "One has agreed to cooperate in exchange for court protection, which I consider useful. He confirms that Radzivich knows the witness has been contacted and has activated 3 additional search teams." "Timeline?" Vladislav said, Radzivich will call a forced convening of his own, Seraphiel said. Within 72 hours. He'll have enough court representatives assembled to attempt an illegitimate tribunal. If he can frame the compact as already broken before the witness invokes the clause, it may hold in blood law, barely, but it may hold. Vladislav turned to Cordelia. The convening has to happen in the next 48 hours. Where? She said immediately. The founding ground, he said. Prague, beneath the old city. All 5 courts have standing access. It is the only location where a witnessing is blood valid. Prague, she said. Tonight, if you are willing, he said. She straightened, pushed up her glasses. I need my passport, she said, and my phone, and if it's at all possible, a change of clothes, because I have a feeling appearing before 5 vampire courts in a cardigan is not optimal. He felt something that was definitively not a smile start somewhere in his chest, and exercise considerable restraint on its journey upward. We can accommodate all of that. The flight was private. Arranged through one of the Harrogate Court's surface holdings, a company whose legal structure was complicated, but whose fleet of aircraft was not. Cordelia spent the first hour of the flight reading through the full translated text of the Vethara Compact, which Vladislav had provided in a bound folder. She made margin notes in pencil, which she produced from her own bag, because apparently she carried pencils, and occasionally asked him questions that cut directly to the structural weaknesses and logical gaps in the 340-year-old document. He answered them. And somewhere around the 3rd question, he stopped being surprised that she was finding weaknesses he had spent decades accommodating, and simply started thinking of her as a collaborator, which was an instinct he had not trusted to anyone outside his court in a very long time. Seraphiel, seated across the aisle with her own documentation, caught his eye once and said nothing. But her expression said everything that she had chosen not to say, and he responded to it with a very precise look that communicated an instruction to continue choosing not to say it. She smiled, very slightly, for the first time in recent memory. At some point after midnight, Cordelia fell asleep in the window seat, with the compact folder still open across her lap. He watched her sleep for exactly as long as it took him to confirm she was comfortable, and not in any distress, and then he looked out the opposite window at the dark below, and the darker sky above, and tried to think clearly about what was happening. He had not, in 700 years, allowed anyone who was not of his court to matter to him personally. The concept of personal mattered to vampires differently than it did to humans, because forever was a different kind of weight than a lifetime, and things that mattered personally had a way of becoming catastrophic over the scale of forever. He had learned that. He had learned it at enormous cost in the 3rd century of his existence, and he had not unlearned it since, but Cordelia Ellis, with her pencil and her building plans and her specific brand of courage, and the way she said things with exactly as much weight as they deserved, and not a syllable more, was making it difficult to maintain the careful architecture of not mattering. And she was doing it entirely without effort or intention, which he found both more understandable and more dangerous than any deliberate attempt could have been. He picked up the compact folder carefully from her lap and set it on the seat tray without waking her. That, he thought, was all he was going to permit himself to do with any of it until after Prague. Prague opened before them, in the grey pre-dawn, the city still beautiful and dark, and wholly unaware that its ancient underground was about to host a confrontation that would determine the stability of the next century. The car from the airport moved through the old city in silence. The entrance to the founding ground was through an unremarkable door in a building off Malá Strana that looked, in every observable way, like a storage facility. Below the first basement, accessed through a mechanism that Vladislav operated with a specific combination of pressure and what Cordelia would later describe as clearly something biological that I don't need to fully understand. The founding ground opened into a space that stopped her in her tracks. It was vast. A cavern of carved stone that had been shaped not by nature, but by intention over centuries of refinement. Its ceiling lost in shadow. Its walls lined with the symbols of 5 courts in raised relief, its central space occupied by a great circular table of black stone that had never, in its 340-year existence, hosted a legitimate witnessing. "This is where it was signed," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. 1683. The 5 courts were threatening exactly the kind of conflict they are threatening now. The compact held them. She walked forward to the edge of the circle. Not crossing it, just looking, and he watched her understand the weight of the place with the particular sensitivity of someone who worked with historical things and knew how to feel the age of them. "How does the invocation work exactly?" she said. "The ceremony." You stand in the center," he said, "and you speak the formal claim which I will provide to you word for word. The blood law requires a living witness of the Ellis bloodline. The court's own records confirm your lineage. When you speak the claim, all 5 courts are bound by the compact to hear it. The 40-day peace activates automatically under blood law. No court can legally initiate violence until the peace period expires. And Radzivich knows all of this. Which is why we are here 48 hours before his planned tribunal rather than after it, Vladislav said. He cannot stop an invocation that has already occurred. She nodded, turning from the circle. She was, he thought, about to say something measured and practical and intelligent when the chamber doors on the far side of the room opened. They were not the doors through which he had entered. There were 5 of them, and they were not his court. The lead figure was tall and silver-haired and older-looking in the specific way that very ancient vampires sometimes allowed themselves to appear when they wanted to convey authority, the particular weight of age as a kind of threat. He wore a coat that was a deliberate echo of aristocratic military dress, and his eyes were the color of ice over very deep water. Radzivich, in person, after 3 centuries of indirect knowledge, Vladislav felt the full force of him as a political entity and a physical one simultaneously. Ancient, genuinely powerful, and furious in the specific way that very controlled people are furious when something has moved faster than they planned. He had brought 4 of his court, all old, all formidable. Vladislav moved to stand directly beside Cordelia, close enough that his arm was against hers. "Darkmoor," Radzivich said, and his voice had centuries in it, all of them cold. "You move quickly for someone who found the name 6 days ago." "I had adequate motivation," Vladislav said. Radzevich's eyes moved to Cordelia. He studied her with the detached appraisal of someone examining an obstacle. "The witness," he said. "A librarian, of all the forms the clause might take." "She is standing right here," Cordelia said, "and she has a name." Something in Radzevich's expression shifted slightly. He had not expected her to speak. Vladislav had not expected it to feel, in that moment, like something powerful. "Miss Ellis," Radzivich said with a courtesy that was entirely a weapon, "you do not understand what you are walking into. The compact is a relic. Its blood law is 4 centuries out of date. The world has changed. Vampire society has changed. What you are being asked to preserve is a structure that has outlived its purpose, and your agreement to serve as witness will not save it. It will simply delay its inevitable end by 40 days. "Then 40 days is what you're afraid of," she said. Radzevich's eyes narrowed. "If the compact's end is truly inevitable, 40 days wouldn't be enough to change anything," she said. "And you wouldn't be here, in person before dawn, with 4 of your court, trying to talk me out of a ceremony that only delays an outcome you've already decided is certain. You're afraid 40 days is enough. Which means whatever you're trying to accomplish depends on happening in the next 48 hours. The silence in the founding chamber was absolute. Vladislav felt something shift in the air beside him and realized it was pride. Simple and enormous, and not his to have, and entirely involuntary. Radzivich looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Vladislav. "Interesting witness," he said, and it was not a compliment, but it was not quite contempt either. "I agree," Vladislav said. "I cannot allow the invocation to proceed," Radzivich said. The courtesy was gone. What remained was the actual thing beneath it, which was the immovable conviction of someone who had spent centuries making the world conform to his intentions. "You know I cannot, Darkmoor. The compact's activation would collapse everything I have built. I will not permit it." "You do not have the authority to permit or not permit," Vladislav said. "That is rather the point. I have the authority of 3 courts that have already agreed to stand with me when the compact is declared void," Radzivich said. "You have one court, Darkmoor, and a human librarian." "That is all the compact requires," Vladislav said. "It is not enough to stop what is already in motion." "We are about to find out," Vladislav said. What happened next happened in the space of several seconds that moved in that specific way that extreme danger makes time move, both very fast and very clear. One of Radzevich's court moved, not toward Vladislav, but toward Cordelia, and Vladislav was between them before the movement completed, which was not possible for anything with a human reaction time, but was entirely possible for something 7 centuries old, and what he felt in that fraction of a second was not calculated protection, but something considerably older and more absolute than calculation. He would not permit anyone to touch her. The court member stopped. He had stopped because the expression on Vladislav's face was the expression of something very old, being pushed past the boundary of political restraint into something that had no interest in political considerations at all, and it was an expression that very few people, in 7 centuries, had seen and then recovered from with all of themselves intact. Radzevich raised a hand. His court member stepped back. "I did not come here to create violence in the founding ground," Radzevich said, and his voice had changed. Not softer, more careful. That would violate blood law more severely than any invocation you could make. "Then we are at an impasse," Vladislav said. "Not quite," Radzevich said. And then he did something that Vladislav had not expected, which was the most concerning thing he had done since arriving. He sat down at the black stone table, with the unhurried ease of someone who has decided to have a conversation rather than an altercation. "Sit," he said, "both of you." Vladislav did not sit, but he did not move from beside Cordelia. Cordelia sat. She pulled her chair into the position that gave her a clear view of both Radzevich and the doors behind him, and she folded her hands on the table in front of her with the composed alertness of someone at a particularly difficult reference consultation. "You said 40 days isn't enough to stop what I've built," she said to Radzevich. "But I think you're wrong. I think you're here because 40 days is exactly enough time for the other courts to reconsider their commitments to you, and you know it. The question is what they need in order to reconsider." Radzevich looked at her. Something in his ancient face, carefully composed for centuries, shifted into something unexpected. Reluctant respect is a specific expression, and it crossed his features like a shadow. "Clever," he said. "What do the 3 courts that support you actually want?" she said. "Not what Radzevich wants. What do they want individually?" The chamber went very quiet. Vladislav stood beside her and felt, with a kind of awe that he would have found embarrassing to admit, that he was watching someone conduct a negotiation in a vampire founding chamber at 4 in the morning in Prague with the same focused intelligence she had applied to resolving a library access dispute, and that it was genuinely extraordinary, and that he was in considerable difficulty in terms of his earlier resolution to not let her matter too much. Radzevich said slowly, "The Mirianu court wants guarantees of sovereign territory. The Vethis bloodline is seeking a formal recognition of their post-Compact founding. The Solofavar court is smaller and simply does not want to be absorbed." "All of those things can be addressed within the Compact's framework," Cordelia said. "The original text has an amendment provision. It hasn't been used, but it exists." "The amendment provision requires a unanimous agreement of all 5 courts," Radzevich said. "Which you'd have," she said, "if you were willing to bring your actual demands to a legitimate negotiation rather than dissolving the compact entirely. The dissolution route gives you dominance, but the amendment route gives you legal security. Which is more useful over the long term to a court that has existed for 8 centuries? Radzevich was silent. Vladislav looked down at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Radzevich with those sharp, dark eyes, entirely steady. "You cannot promise any of this," Radzevich said finally. "I can witness it," she said. "That's what a witness does. I can witness a new agreement as readily as I can invoke the old one. But only if all 5 courts come to the table. If you've already committed to dissolution, then I invoke the clause. You get 40 days of peace, and 3 courts reconsider whether Radzevich's leadership is worth the instability. Either way, I stand in that circle. The only question is what the ceremony is for." The silence this time lasted considerably longer. Vladislav set his hand very lightly on the back of her chair. It was not a proprietary gesture. It was something else. Something that said, "I see what you are doing, and it is remarkable," and that had no other form available to him in that moment. Radzevich looked from Cordelia to Vladislav and back. She proposed this herself, he said. This was not your strategy. No, Vladislav said. You found a witness, Radzovich said slowly, who is also a negotiator. I found the witness, Vladislav said. Everything else is Cordelia Ellis. Another silence. Then Radzovich said, I need to contact the 3 aligned courts. You have 12 hours, Vladislav said. 24, Radzovich said. 18, Cordelia said. Radzovich looked at her, and this time the expression was something that was almost, from 8 centuries of distance, almost the beginning of an alliance. 18, he agreed. He left with his 4 court members, and the founding chamber door closed behind them. And the silence was sudden and enormous, and Cordelia let out a breath that was approximately 3 hours of sustained composure, releasing all at once. Vladislav moved around the table and sat in the chair beside her, which was the first time he had sat voluntarily since the study in Edinburgh. And he looked at her profile in the light of the founding chamber and said, quietly, That was not what I had planned. What had you planned? She said. A ceremony, an invocation, a political victory achieved by speed and positioning. He paused. What you proposed is potentially more durable than anything I had architected. A witnessing of a new agreement instead of an invocation of an old clause, she said. It creates more buy-in from the parties. They choose the new terms rather than being compelled by the old ones. It's less likely to be challenged. Yes, he said. Exactly yes. She looked at him. They were very close, and the chamber was very quiet, and she said, You're looking at me like that again. Like what? He said. Like you're surprised, she said. You've been surprised by me all day. I have, he said. Why? You spent 340 years searching for this bloodline. Didn't you have any expectations? I had expectations of a witness, he said. I did not have expectations of you. She looked at him for a moment that stretched past simple conversation into something warmer and more uncertain. When this is finished, she said slowly, when there's a new agreement and it's witnessed and the courts are stable, what happens to you? I return to Harrogate Court, he said. Continue what I have always done alone? The word was careful. She had chosen it carefully, which meant it was carrying weight she was not yet ready to name. He was quiet for a moment. He had been alive long enough to know that this was the precise moment that mattered, that the next words were not merely words but a door, and that he was entirely capable of walking past it without opening it, which he had done before, which he had been very good at for a very long time. He said, I have spent 340 years searching for a name, because a dying woman told me it mattered. I found the name this morning, and the name is a woman who reads building plans for comfort and argues with entitled researchers and proposes diplomatic solutions to 8-century-old vampire lords at 4 a.m. in a Czech cave. He stopped. I do not particularly want to be without that. Cordelia Ellis was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, I don't know how any of this works. Between a human and a vampire. I don't know the rules or the blood law or the practical logistics of whatever life that would be. There are very few precedents, he agreed. But you have 7 centuries of experience navigating complicated situations with inadequate precedent. I do. And I'm reasonably good at research, she said. Exceptionally good, he said. I think that is precisely the right word. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one he had not been able to read before. And now, in the quiet of the founding chamber, he could read it clearly, because it was the same thing he was feeling, which was terror that was almost indistinguishable from hope. All right, she said. We figure it out as we go. He reached across the table, slowly, and took her hand. She turned her hand under his and held it, and that was the whole of it, for now. But it was the whole of it, and it was enough. The next 18 hours were complex and required all of them. Radzevich contacted the 3 aligned courts, and the conversations were long and difficult, and required Vladislav to make 3 concessions he had hoped to avoid, and Cordelia to explain the concept of a witnessed amendment agreement to 2 court representatives who were deeply suspicious of anything that had not existed in their political framework 300 years ago, which she did with the patience of someone who had spent years explaining archival access protocols to people who did not want to follow them. The Mirianu court agreed first. When Cordelia identified the specific territorial language they needed and drafted, in clean, precise sentences, a framework that addressed it. Their representative, an ancient vampire named Vasilieva, looked at the draft, looked at Cordelia, and said to Vladislav in Romanian-accented English, "Where did you find her?" "Edinburgh," Vladislav said. "Keep her," Vasilieva said. The Vethis bloodline representative was harder. He wanted formal recognition that his founding predated the compact, which was a historical claim that the other courts disputed. Cordelia spent 40 minutes with him and the founding documents and found, in the original Latin of the pre-compact charters, a reference that supported a nuanced version of his claim that was accurate without requiring the other courts to concede the disputed points. He read it 3 times, then looked at her with an expression that suggested he was reassessing the intellectual capacity of humans as a category. The Solovar court sent a representative who spent the first 10 minutes of the conversation trying to determine if Cordelia could be pressured. Vladislav stood very still beside her during this process, which communicated without a syllable that this line of inquiry had a defined end. The Solovar representative redirected to substantive concerns, which were legitimate and addressable, and the conversation became productive. By mid-afternoon, all 5 courts had representatives present in the founding chamber, including Radzevich, who had arrived last and said nothing, but who was there, which was the binding fact. The founding circle glowed, slightly, with the particular phosphorescence that ancient vampire blood law sites develop over centuries of being the site of significant oaths. It had not done this before, as far as Vladislav could find in any record. He thought the building had been waiting. Cordelia stood in the center of the circle and held the new agreement text, which she had largely written herself with input from all 5 courts over the preceding hours, and which was a remarkable document for its precision and its fairness, and for the fact that it contained in its preamble a phrase that none of the courts had suggested, and that she had inserted because it was accurate and because it mattered. The phrase read, "Witnessed in acknowledgement that the stability of this agreement serves not only the 5 founding courts, but the wider world in which all courts and all human lives are held in common." She read the invocation text that Vladislav had provided, first which formally activated her status as witness under the old clause. It cost her nothing. It gave the ceremony its legal foundation. Then she read the new agreement, section by section, in the specific cadence that blood law required, and the chamber did what blood law chambers do. It held the words and made them binding, and glowed rather more than it had before. When she finished, the silence was different from all the silences before it. It was the silence of something completed. All 5 court representatives signed, in the blood law fashion, which involved a brief and not entirely comfortable ritual that Cordelia observed with composed scientific interest, and which Vladislav made as brief as possible, because he could see that, while she was handling it with remarkable composure, she was also human, and it was 4 in the afternoon, and she had not slept properly in 24 hours. Radzevich was the last to sign. He stood before her afterward, 8 centuries of pride and ambition behind his ice-colored eyes, and he said, "You are not what I expected." "That seems to be a theme today," she said. Something moved across his ancient face. It was, Vladislav thought, the closest thing to respect that Radzevich was capable of extending to anyone. "The compact is stronger for having been renegotiated than it would have been for simply being invoked," Radzevich said. "I am aware of that. I am also aware of who is responsible for the distinction." "The courts made the choice," Cordelia said. "I just provided the framework." Radzevich looked at Vladislav. "I withdraw the search teams," he said. "The blood law of the signed agreement covers the witness's personal security under all 5 courts' protections. She cannot be touched without all 5 courts declaring violation." "I know," Vladislav said. "Good," Radzevich said, and left. Vasilieva of the Marianu court paused beside Cordelia on the way out and said, very quietly, "You have an open invitation to our court, whenever you choose. We have an archive that would interest you, 8th century, mostly intact." Cordelia looked, for the first time all day, genuinely tempted by something entirely personal. "I would love that," she said. When all 5 delegations had gone, the founding chamber was empty, except for Vladislav, Cordelia, and Seraphiel, who had been a silent and invaluable presence throughout the day, and who now moved toward the exit with the tact of someone who has earned 8 centuries of reading a room correctly. "I'll see to the vehicles," Seraphiel said, and was gone. Cordelia stood in the center of the circle, which had stopped glowing, and looked down at the ancient stone beneath her feet. Her cardigan was wrinkled, and her hair had largely escaped its pinning, and she still had the pencil tucked behind her ear from hours ago. Vladislav walked into the circle and stood beside her. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "The agreement is real, the peace is binding. The 5 courts have legal structure that's more stable than anything that existed before." "Yes," he said, "and I negotiated vampire blood law in a Prague cave," she said. "Using diplomatic principles I'm fairly sure were developed for library consortium agreements." He felt the thing in his chest that had been working its way upward since Edinburgh finally arrive at his face. "The principles are sound regardless of their origin." She looked up at him. She looked tired and brilliant, and entirely herself, and he was standing so close that she had to tilt her head up slightly, and her dark eyes had the particular quality they got when she was looking directly at something she intended to understand. "You should have told Radzovich the truth," she said. "When he asked what you expected, you said you found the witness. But you were also already thinking of her as something else, weren't you?" "Yes," he said. "When did that start?" "The photograph," he said, "before I had met you, which is less extraordinary than it sounds. Because the photograph communicated something true about you, and what was true about you was already extraordinary." She looked at him. She reached up and pulled the pencil from behind her ear and looked at it, and then, with the specific decision-making directness that he had come to understand was simply how she was built, she tucked it into his coat pocket. "I want to see the Harrogate Court archive," she said. "Properly, not because I'm a witness. Because I'm interested. There are 16,000 documents in the Harrogate archive dating before the 16th century, he said. You would be occupied for some time." "Good," she said. "I have a lot of questions about vampire history." "You always have a lot of questions," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Is that going to be a problem?" He looked at her. This woman who had walked through the most dangerous day of her life, with a pencil and her wits, and the particular bravery of someone who has simply decided to be useful, who had rewritten the vampire political order with the same position-focused intelligence she applied to helping researchers find what they were looking for, who was standing in the oldest blood law circle in existence looking at him like she intended to understand and him too, and he thought of 340 years, and of a dying woman who had pressed her palm to his cheek, and of all the searching, all the distance, all the patience of an immortal who had learned to carry hope very carefully, because hope has a tendency across centuries to become very heavy. "No," he said, "it is not going to be a problem." She smiled, which he had not seen in full before, only the beginnings of it, and the full version was something he intended to spend a considerable amount of time studying. She took his hand, as she had in Edinburgh, and he held it, and they stood in the founding circle that had just witnessed a peace, and outside Prague moved through its ordinary evening entirely unaware of what had occurred beneath it. In the weeks that followed, the world above continued as worlds do, which is to say with its full complement of ordinary days and extraordinary ones, with no particular acknowledgement of the fact that below it, something ancient had been remade. The 5 courts entered the 40-day peace period and began negotiations in earnest, using the framework that Cordelia had drafted and that all parties were now operating within. The Mirienu court's territorial concerns were addressed through a series of formal recognitions that required considerable back-and-forth drafting, much of which passed through Cordelia's hands, not because she was obligated, but because she was, by that point, the person who had the clearest understanding of what each court actually needed, as distinct from what they were saying they needed. She kept her position at the Aldermore Public Archive, because of course she did. She also began spending 3 evenings a week at Harrogate Court, initially in the archive, where 16,000 pre-16th century documents were not going to organize and cross-reference themselves. Vladislav joined her there, sometimes to answer historical questions, sometimes to simply be in the same room, working at his own desk at the far end of the archive space, which was very large and had excellent lighting for both of them. and which contained more silence that was comfortable than noise that was necessary. Seraphiel regarded this development with the expression of someone who had been alive for 812 years and had sufficient context to recognize an inevitable outcome when it was in progress. She said nothing. She did, however, begin ensuring that the archive was stocked with tea on the evenings that Cordelia was expected, which was a very specific form of approval from someone who expressed nothing lightly. 3 weeks after Prague, Vladislav found Cordelia in the archive past midnight, still working, with a stack of documents that she had been cross-referencing against a modern genealogical database she had connected to her laptop with the cheerful audacity of someone who has decided that a 300-year-old archive simply needs better indexing. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, not announced, not interrupting, just looking at the specific sight of her, because in 3 weeks of evenings he had found that looking at her was something he had not run out of anything to find, which was new, which was rather the point. She looked up without him making a sound, which by now he had come to expect. She had very good awareness of the room for a human. "You should go to sleep," she said, "or whatever you do." "I do not sleep in the conventional sense," he said. "I know," she said. "I read the Harrogate medical records, with Seraphiel's permission." "Don't make a face. The face is very aristocratic. It's impressive, but I'm immune." He was not making a face. He was doing something with his expression that was in the general vicinity of the face, which was a distinction he was reasonably confident she was not interested in. He crossed the archive to her end and sat in the chair across the work table from her. She had organized, in the past 3 weeks, an entire section of the archive that had been uncatalogued for 60 years. She had also, apparently, read the court medical records. "What did the medical records tell you?" he said. "That you rest," she said, "in a specific state that is somewhat like deep meditation, that you don't require it every night, but that you're better without extended deprivation, that you can be in daylight with the compound, but that it costs you energy that takes longer to recover than the medical staff would like." She looked at him over her glasses. "You were in daylight for 3 hours the day you found me." "I was." "The records suggest that was not comfortable." "It was not," he said. "You did it anyway," she said. "Yes, because you didn't want me to be afraid of you before I had met you properly." He considered this. It was accurate, and it was also somewhat more than accurate. But the additional component was the one he had been approaching from the side for 3 weeks, stepping toward it and stepping away, which was not behavior he recognized as belonging to someone who had been navigating the world with certainty for 7 centuries. "Yes," he said, "and then because she deserved all of it, and because I had read everything there was to find about you before I arrived, and I had already decided that you warranted the effort." She looked at him steadily. "Before you had met me." "Before I had met you," he confirmed. She closed her laptop. She set her pencil down. She folded her hands on the table in the precise way she did when she was arriving at a conclusion she intended to act on. "Vladislav," she said, and it was the first time she had used his full name, not the formal address, but the name itself, and it did something to the air between them. "Yes," he said. "I want to say something, and I need you to listen to it before you say anything," she said. "All right," he said. "I am not a person who does things by half," she said. "I don't do my job by half. I don't do research by half. I don't invest in things I'm not prepared to see through. And I know that you have 7 centuries of experience with everything, except, apparently, this specific thing. And I know that what this is between us is something that has no adequate precedent, and that the logistics of it are complicated, and that there are blood laws and court politics, and the fact that I am going to grow old in a way that you are not, and we have not talked about any of that, and we're going to have to talk about all of it." She paused, looked at him. "But I want to. I want to talk about all of it. I want to figure it out. And I think from the way you have been looking at me for 3 weeks, that you want that too. But you are being very careful and very honorable and very aristocratic about it. And I respect all of those things, and they are also driving me slightly insane." He looked at her. The archive was quiet around them. 16,000 documents listening, and the fire in the hearth was low, and Edinburgh was above them, going about its ordinary nighttime business. And he was sitting across a work table from a woman who had walked into the most dangerous situation of her life and negotiated a peace for a world she had not known existed, and who was now looking at him with those sharp, dark eyes and saying, with characteristic directness, exactly what was true. He stood. He came around the work table. He stopped beside her chair, and she turned to look up at him, and he took her hand from where it rested on the table and held it. "I have been careful," he said, "because you are not someone I will treat carelessly, and I am honorable because that is what you deserve. And the aristocratic aspect is somewhat structural, I am afraid, and unlikely to resolve entirely." He paused. "But I have also been for 3 weeks in the presence of the most remarkable person I have encountered in 700 years, and I have been very deliberately not saying so, and you have correctly identified this as behavior that serves neither of us." She stood. She was nearly a foot shorter than him, and she looked up at him without the slightest inclination to find that diminishing which was very much her. 700 years is a long time to be waiting for something to matter, she said. "It is," he agreed. "I am not interested in waiting any longer." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it, which was not a contemporary gesture, but was an honest one, and she watched him do it with those dark eyes that saw everything and judged nothing unfairly. Then she reached up with her free hand and took his face in her palm, and he went very still, the way only things that have been waiting a very long time go still when they arrive, and she said, "We do have to talk about all of it. The complicated things." "We do," he said. "I will tell you about all of them. Every blood law, every complicated logistics, everything that has no precedent, and we will figure it out together," she said. "Together," he said, and she rose on her toes and kissed him, which was quiet and real and enormously. Specifically itself, not a metaphor or a symbol, but an actual kiss in an actual archive at midnight in Edinburgh, and he held it for the full length of something that had been 340 years in the finding. The months that followed were, as promised, complicated, and as promised, they worked through all of it. The court negotiations concluded successfully at the end of the 40-day peace period, with the 5 courts signing the amended Compact Act in a second ceremony that was considerably less dramatic than the first, but considerably more stable. The territorial concerns of the Mirianu court were formalized. The Vithis bloodline received its charter recognition in language that Cordelia had refined to the word. The Solovar court's independence was guaranteed by specific provisions that Vladislav had argued for with characteristic immovability. Radzevich's court signed last, and this time the expression on the ancient lord's face was one of someone who has lost a specific battle and is reassessing whether the war was worth fighting in the first place. He sent Cordelia a gift afterward. It was a manuscript, 13th century illuminated, from his court's personal collection. It was a history of the 5 founding bloodlines that had never been available to any non-court member. The accompanying note said only, "The library at Harrogate does not have this. You may want to acquire it." Cordelia catalogued it within the week and sent back a formal archival receipt, which Seraphiel confirmed was the most effective piece of diplomatic correspondence the court had received in 40 years. Vladislav read the receipt and thought about how entirely correct Vasilieva of the Mirianu court had been. There were conversations, as promised, about everything complicated, about what immortality meant and what aging meant, and what the years ahead would look like, with the specific honesty that both of them had decided was non-negotiable between them. There were no perfect answers. There were options. The court's physician had worked, over the centuries, on various approaches to the question of human-vampire partnerships that were not unprecedented in court history, not common but not uncharted either. There were choices that was hers to make without pressure and without timeline, offered fully and held open, because he would not take from her the one thing that was entirely hers. They talked about it for a long time, over many evenings in the archive and over dinners that he arranged with specific attention to what she liked, and over walks in the parts of Edinburgh that were quiet past midnight. They talked about it with a particular combination of practicality and tenderness that characterized everything they did, which was to say that they were very honest and very careful, and found, as they talked, that the complicated things were navigable when they were faced directly rather than avoided, which was a principle that applied to blood law and to love with equal force. She decided, in the end, with full information and no urgency, and the complete confidence of someone who had thought everything through and was prepared to see it through, as she always was. The court physician had administered what needed to be administered with all appropriate care, and the process was what it was, and she came through it with the specific quality that she brought to everything, which was that she accepted it as real and proceeded from there. The Aldermore Public Archive received, from an anonymous donor, an endowment sufficient to fund a new special collections wing and a dedicated archivist position for the next century, which Cordelia had absolutely nothing to do with, and about which she said only that the donor had excellent taste in institutions. On the evening of the first day that she tested the extended evening hours that were now, quietly, available to her, she walked into the Harrogate archive and found Vladislav at his desk, and he looked up, and whatever he saw in her face made him set down his pen and stand and cross the room in the particular way he moved when he was not moderating himself for the benefit of human observers. "How do you feel?" he said. "Strange," she said honestly. "Good strange. Like something has settled." She paused. "Like finding the right document in a catalogue that's been disordered for years." He took her face in both his hands, which he now did without the careful restraint of before, and she leaned into it without the slight hesitation of before, and the archive held them both in its old stone quiet. "I looked for your name for 340 years, he said. "I know," she said, "and when I found it, I found rather more than I was looking for." She smiled at him, the full version, the one he had never run out of reasons to study. "That's very often how research works," she said. "You look for one thing and you find the thing that was actually important." He kissed her forehead, then her temple then, because he had also long since abandoned moderation as a principle in this particular context, put properly. Outside, Edinburgh was doing what Edinburgh does, which is existing with enormous character in the rain, above layers of history that the living walk over without knowing. Above and below, the world continued in all its ordinary and extraordinary ways, held together by laws and oaths, and the quiet work of people who keep things from falling apart, and by the occasional remarkable discovery made by someone searching long enough, carefully enough, and with enough trust to recognize what they find when they find it. Seraphiel appeared in the archive doorway at some point, looked at the scene with the expression of someone who has seen 8 centuries of outcomes, and is prepared to rate this one very highly, and then went to make tea. Which was, all things considered, exactly right.